Hello, everyone. It is great to be with you again today. This is Joyce Davis. I'm president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg. And once again, we are here with our Great Decisions discussion. We are doing these discussions every Tuesday at 5 o'clock as a webinar, as a Zoom webinar that we're streaming live to Facebook. But we are also going to end one. The last one is going to actually be in person at the Frederickson Library. And this is a good opportunity to thank the Frederickson Library for once again being a sponsor of this important community dialogue. Where else are you going to be able to get together with such leading experts to discuss the top issues of the day? So today our topic is actually going to be a difficult one: economic warfare. But we have experts ready to lead that. It won't be me today. I'm just saying hello to you. But I'm going to turn it over to Russell Goodman, who is a member of our board. And some of you know he happens to be my husband, but he has spent more than a decade, probably 2 decades, in global logistics and supply chain management. So he kind of knows this territory a little bit better than I do. But we also have Dr. Sanjay Paul, and Russell will introduce Dr. Sanjay Paul, who's a friend of our council and who's a professor and is well experienced and well equipped to lead our conversation today. So with that, I see that people are coming in, and we are going to start as you know we do our video. And then we will end the video and begin our conversation. And we do encourage you, get your questions ready, get your comments ready. I think I have the way that I can even let you say your comment, at least hear your voice if you want, I can do that. Otherwise, you should type them into the Q&A. So with that, Cam, I don't know if you're here to help us with the back end. If not, I will do it, but just let us know if you're able to start the video. I guess Cam is not able to start the video, so let's see. I will try to do that for us now. Oh, there she is. Oh, excellent. Thank you, Cam. All right, here we go.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions. We reached the midway point today in our 8-lecture masterclass by turning our attention to topic number 4, which is economic warfare. Prussian General von Clausewitz famously noted, "War is a continuation of policy by other means." By that same token, we could say that economic sanctions are a continuation of policy, if not war, by other means as well. The League of Nations placed economic sanctions at the center of its global ordering principles. The belief that nation-states, from a liberal point of view, were bound together in a society, a league, or a global community that was bound by norms, rules, and expectations, and that over time, this society became even stronger. In the event that one of the members of the global system departed from the norms, the rules, the behavior that was acceptable, that nation state would immediately be isolated and sanctioned by all of the other members of the League of Nations. If necessary, that country would be cut off from global trade routes and any opportunity to have economic engagement with the other nations. Interestingly enough, the first time that this strategy was employed happened decades after the League of Nations ceased to exist. In the 1960s, Rhodesia was the first nation to be comprehensively economically sanctioned by the international community and approved by the UN Security Council, forcing that minority white regime to give way to public appeals for democracy. Zimbabwe was the result. Realists view the world quite differently. They see a collection of nation states, large and small, influential and not, and oftentimes clustered in small groups or alliances. In the event that one of those nation states is targeted by the others, there's a very high probability that it will be shielded by its more powerful allies. Iran is a classic example. While the United States seeks to apply maximum pressure to the Iranian regime for its nuclear weapons program and belligerent behavior, many nations continue to trade with it for their own interest. Efforts to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel similarly have resulted in a divided international community. When we think about economic sanctions and economic warfare, therefore, we have to take into context the relationship that the targeted country has with other nations in the system. Are they willing to abandon it, to punish it, or are they going to shield and protect it? And that discussion takes place within the context of broader economic policies. We have three main considerations today before we turn our attention to U.S. foreign policy options. We begin with economic systems, the declining U.S.-led system of post-World War II, and then we consider test cases for economic sanctions and warfare, Russia and China. Global economic systems have evolved over time. In the early part of modern world history, from 1500 until 1945, the dominant system was called mercantilism. After World War II ended, the United States led a global system based upon market principles, free trade, and capitalism. Over the course of the past 20 years or so, we've seen that system in decay, making us wonder, will there be a wholly new economic system or some sort of mix of capitalism and mercantilism? So what exactly is mercantilism? It views economics as a zero-sum game, meaning if there are two actors, one of them will lose and the other one will win, and usually in similar fashions. It places national interest and control over the economy above all other concerns, and it places a very high premium on a surplus trade balance. In other words, exporting more to other countries than you import to your own. And finally, the accumulation of wealth is central to the well-being and security of a nation state. Running up national debts sounds off alarm bells to the mercantilists. We'll exemplify. Two nation states, A and B, trading with one another, and then one of those two, country B, decides to raise some protectionist economic barriers. This can be in the form of tariffs or taxes that are levied against foreign imports, quotas that limit the number of items another country can ship to your country, or perhaps subsidies to give the domestic production an unfair advantage. Because of these protectionist measures, the amount of goods that flow into country B is going to be diminished, and that allows it to accumulate wealth. After all, it is exporting more than it's importing. The net result is a positive balance. It can use that money if it wishes to underwrite more industrial competitiveness at home, furthering the protectionism measures implemented earlier. As a result, the flow of goods coming in declines and the amount expands. Country B is clearly the winner in this dyad. Country A is on the losing end. It is seeing an accumulation of debt. As a result of that, the public pressure is mounting on it to change its economic policies. You simply cannot allow another country to take advantage of yours this way, and the result is it's going to begin to create and implement economic sanctions, economic tariffs, quotas, or other protectionist measures. At the end of the day, under mercantilism, both sides end up losing. They're missing out on the opportunity to grow next to each other, to both profit from a vibrant and healthy trade relationship. We saw this warning in 1920 from John Maynard Keynes, one of the most influential economists of the 20th century. He went to Paris briefly, where the Peace of Versailles was being negotiated, the end of World War I, and the post-war political order. He walked away in frustration and wrote one of the more interesting books in recent economic history. What he called for in that book was economic integration. Put aside your differences with Germany, allow it to trade with France, with England, and other countries. Don't punish it, because doing so can lead to economic catastrophe. He essentially predicted the Great Depression 8 years before it occurred. In 1920, coming off of the heels of the First World War, mercantilist policies were adopted, beggar thy neighbor economic policies. What this means is that you're blaming your neighbors for all of your domestic ills, allowing you to drive a political and economic agenda that otherwise may not have been successful. There was an economic collapse of Europe and the world, the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany, and then an even larger conflict among nations, World War II. Before the Second World War was over, in 1944, the United States invited leadership from around the world to join it at Bretton Woods in New England to discuss the post-World War II economic order. John Maynard Keynes, not surprisingly, was a central figure in that discussion. It led to the U.S. economic system known as the Liberal International Economic Order, which was based on free trade and capital market principles. The liberal economic order began with U.S. leadership. We were clearly the dominant power in the world after 1945, both economically and militarily. To the surprise of many nations, we did not take away the resources of the vanquished. Yes, we defeated and occupied Germany as well as Japan, but we told the other countries of the world that they would be allowed to have access to our market, to our economy, that we would underwrite a global economic system that would benefit all based upon free trade and universal admission. What are the components of the American system? We began with the gold standard, linking the U.S. dollar to gold because of the confidence that gold has globally. And then we allowed other nations to link their currency to the U.S. dollar. And that meant that local currencies were literally as good as gold. It encouraged countries to maintain their currency and allowed them to fight off massive inflation after World War II. Reciprocity means that if you lower your tariff barriers, we will do the same. International institutions were created to manage this global economic system, such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the predecessor to the World Trade Organization, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, all designed to promote reciprocity, free trade, and global prosperity. And then finally, there was the United States there as the lender of last resort. If the IMF would not bail you out, the United States would help you get through an economic crisis and move on with a free trade system. The success of the U.S.-led international economic order is rather remarkable. Beginning in 1945, global trade, prosperity, economic prowess grew across the globe, especially in nations that fell under the U.S. sphere of influence. When the Cold War ended in 1990, when communism was exposed, the global system grew even more rapidly. But that system did not last forever. We've seen its decline over the course of the last 30 to 50 years, depending on which economist you speak with. Japan has steadfastly refused to adapt to our system. It maintains a mercantilist order with high levels of protectionism. China has risen, taking advantage of the global system led by the United States, but it as well is manipulating its currency and preventing free access to its markets. A relative economic leveling of the world. This is, after all, the natural conclusion of capitalism. Everyone can succeed, no guarantees, of course, but as the global system erases the boundaries that separate economies, everyone in the world begins to catch up with those above them. And waning American support for a global free trade regime. The economic order is viewed more as benefiting the world and globalist elites as opposed to people who live in the American Midwest or who struggle, especially in rural areas. U.S. support for international free trade was at a low point before World War II. Then came the realization that global free trade was in our interest, and popularity rose rather rapidly. When Nixon took the U.S. off the gold standard, and in the aftermath of the OPEC oil crisis, we began to see a movement away from the so-called long decade, which from 1948 until about 1970 was one of great economic prosperity. There was continual decline in public support for free trade, and that decline has continued in the aftermath of the Trump election in 2016. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was to be the gold standard, to quote Hillary Clinton, of Pacific free trade. It was to erase borders, economic boundaries, and allow for massive movement of goods and services across the entire region. It was proposed in 2015, strongly endorsed by the Obama administration, linking these 12 countries, minus the United States, which opted out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. One of the reasons we have fallen out of love with free trade is the people that it does leave behind. Capitalism does not guarantee success. It guarantees the opportunity to succeed. There will be winners and there will be losers. Unlike mercantilism, capitalism sees far more winners than it does losers. Trade creates national prosperity, and over time, a nation's wealth will grow as indicated here. But as it does, especially as the global economy becomes more integrated, there will be losers at home. People who cannot compete with low wages in the Philippines or Mexico, cannot produce products that are suddenly in demand and provided by China. And over time, while the national prosperity continues to rise, the number of people who feel disenchanted, who feel they've been taken out and not given a fair opportunity, will continue to grow. If there is a politician who can speak to those people, whether it is Patrick Buchanan of the late 1980s or Donald Trump of 2016, a populist message will be very appealing, and that can become very significant political clout in a national election. Mr. Trump moved the Republican Party a great distance from where Ronald Reagan had positioned it in the 1980s. Reagan, like his counterpart in the UK, Margaret Thatcher, was a stalwart when it came to free trade. He believed deeply in capitalism, open competition. He had confidence that the United States could always prevail in economic relations with other countries. By 2016, much of America was more in line with Donald Trump, and his argument that Japan and China have cheated us out of economic prosperity and economic growth. Even Hillary Clinton, who called the Trans-Pacific Partnership the gold standard by 2016 in a presidential debate, said she as well would pull the United States out of that agreement. So what sort of system is next? If capitalism and free trade are in decay, is there an obvious successor? We begin by looking at the features of the current system. Rather modest leadership, given the decline in the United States in its interest in international free trade, rising nationalism happening almost everywhere, in Asia, Africa, Latin America, North America, and Europe as well, and with it the rise of protectionist barriers, both for trade and immigration. Serious challenges to the supply chain, our ability to keep products moving, important products across a multifaceted, multi-nation system, has been under stress for the past decade. And we're also seeing something emerging in the form of separating spheres of economic systems. During the Cold War era, there was East and West. Ours was always more impressive. It grew economically. The Soviet communist system was never very impressive, and it shrunk economically. When the Soviet Union went away, when communism ended, the United States was the lone economic actor, and by the 21st century, our economic appeal was dominating. However, we have seen of late countries like China, Russia, and India indicating a willingness and interest to cleave off a portion of the globe and trade outside of the U.S.-led economic system. And it's quite possible that other cleavages will emerge, that will see fracturing in the global economic system. And while the U.S. remains the indispensable and dominant economic actor, with trade and ties to all nations, it very likely will improve and increase ties, strengthen them with nations that trade within its economic sphere. We look now at a couple of test cases for economic sanctions, economic warfare. We'll look at Russia and China, beginning with Russia and its recent war in Ukraine. The invasion in February of 2022 led to historic levels of economic sanctions. No one could have predicted the level and the extent of the sanctions imposed on Russia. They are global in nature, and they involve not only nation states directing their economies to go away from Russian markets, but corporations and individuals. When Russia invaded Ukraine, it was fully aware there would be economic pain in the form of Western sanctions. We sanctioned them in 2014 for Crimea. We sanctioned them in 2008 for Georgia. But those were modest sanctions. The West, the United States, France, Germany most notably, had other plans. We wanted to sanction them thoroughly. What actually happened is that the entire globe joined in on the sanctions. Now, don't misunderstand me. Only about 15% of countries in the world are currently sanctioning Russia, but they happen to be 15% of the most important countries to trade with Russia. So the extent of the sanctions is rather remarkable. 15,000 Russian millionaires have fled the country, people who otherwise could be investing in Russia and keeping its economy afloat. Sanctions oftentimes lead to counter-sanctions. When Russia invaded Ukraine, we hit them with economic sanctions, and the Russians hit right back. Their main weapon for those sanctions is natural gas and oil that flows from Russia into Central and Western Europe. As those sanctions continued to take hold, the Russian economy began to feel the pain, the loss of profit, and the discomfort from corporations, individuals, and nations implementing economic sanctions against it. China, of course, is watching on the sidelines, allied with Russia, yet knowing full well that if it traded too closely, it may well get caught up in the global sanctions regime. That has really stayed the hand of China. We now turn our attention to China, a country that's been at the center of our economic policy debate for well over a decade. There's been much talk of a trade war between these two economic giants, and that certainly is something that could happen. Chinese exports of finished goods are very important to the U.S. economy and the consumer. We buy inexpensive products because of Chinese manufacturing capabilities. The supply chain that we use for finished products largely runs through the People's Republic of China. So even if it's not manufactured in China, it may only be packaged there. Rerouting that supply chain would be incredibly expensive and difficult. Chinese parts are central to much of our modern economic society. They're part of the products that we purchase and use on a daily basis, from very basic commodities to sophisticated weaponry used in the American military to our electrical grid. And then finally, and most concerning about this tit-for-tat policy of sanctioning China and it counter-sanctioning is the strong belief on both sides of the Pacific that each side can win this battle. So what are the advantages that China has should there be economic warfare with the United States? Well, the American politics get in the way of any concerted, consistent American response. If you're in office, including the White House, you blame everything on the previous president or senator or member of the House, and you say their policies were all wrong, so you're going to change them. What that means is that if the previous president was sanctioning China, those sanctions are going to be diminished with change of leadership. And the fact that Americans have elections every 2 years for the full House, roughly a third of the U.S. Senate, and every other 2-year cycle, of course, for the White House. And what that means is that any short-term pain in economic well-being because of a trade war with China has incredibly impacting influences on elections. China doesn't have to be bothered. With elections, it doesn't have any. It can focus on the long term as opposed to 2 or 4 year cycles. The United States also has advantages, namely the trade imbalance. For every product we ship to China, we import 4 from China. And that means if we slow down our economic trade with the Chinese, they're going to hurt at a 4-to-1 ratio to us. And then secondly, our economy is just so much more impressive than China's. We could spend an hour easily talking about these in comparative fashion. Safe be it to say, the American economy is thoroughly more impressive. Both sides believing they can win an economic fight means that economic sanctions and possibly a trade war remain a very real possibility moving forward. Finally, we turn to U.S. foreign policy options as it relates to economic warfare. We cannot look at economic trade as all good or all bad. There are benefits and costs to free trade. There are benefits and costs to all positions. The liberals tend to focus on economic growth that is associated with free trade and capitalism and the so-called peace dividend, which means if nation states trade freely with one another, if they grow economically, they're less likely to go to war with each other. Finally, there's the clarity that is provided when international trade is running smoothly. Conservatives argue that the current system has its downsides, namely unfair trade from countries like China and Japan that are robbing America's heartland of economic opportunities and jobs. Jobs are, of course, dislocated as we ship industries south of the border or across the seas to Asia. And then finally, the conservatives, the realists, argue we can only be truly independent as a nation if we end our reliance on foreign trade. The balance between the two is highly debatable. Which way it tips is one of consistent economic discourse. Neocons and America Firsters are found more on the conservative side, which tells us that our recent trend towards criticizing free trade deals and seeking more economic isolation from the world is likely to continue. One final note to be made is a warning about a very popular Chinese app called TikTok. The owners of that app are very closely associated with the Chinese Communist Party. So popular is TikTok that 1 billion people worldwide subscribe to it, including 2/3 of American teenagers. But it goes well beyond America's teenagers. Educators, general members of society, federal agents, government workers, all are subscribers to TikTok, and that means the Chinese government can track all of their behavior online. It can direct information to them in the form of ads or programming that makes them more likely to view China in a favorable fashion. Or it can sow the distrust that we currently have in American elections. Marco Rubio, one day after the 2022 elections, penned an op-ed in the Washington Post calling for a ban on TikTok. I understand why he waited until after his re-election, because taking away something so popular from such a large amount of Americans is politically unviable. Having been elected, he can now argue it's time to look seriously at this sort of economic threat to America's political and economic well-being. I thank you as always for attending this lecture and look forward to seeing you in week 5 when our attention turns to Latin America.
Well, that was a lot to digest, and I'm glad I don't have to do the digesting. I'm going to now turn it over to Russell W. Goodman, a former, now retired executive editor of Supply Chain Brain and an expert in logistics. So there you go, Russell, and you can introduce Dr. Paul.
Well, thank you, Joyce. And let me just say welcome to everyone to our program this evening on economic warfare. Let me just say that I was a bit surprised that our presenter from the Foreign Policy Association spoke at length about economic policy, more so than economic warfare, but perhaps he was setting the stage. And that's something that in just a moment we're going to turn over to our expert for tonight, Dr. Sanjay Paul, Associate Professor of Economics at Elizabethtown College in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. Let me just say that economic warfare, I'm reminded that at the top of the presenter's comments, he mentioned the Clausewitz quote about war by other means. Well, certainly economic warfare is something that many people would say, while it isn't physical combat, it is war by other means, because whether you're talking about withholding credit, whether you're talking about blockading ports, whether you're talking about stringent economic sanctions that they're going to put a crimp in the food supply chain, the implications for the target population can be, and we have seen, devastating from time to time. But aside from the moral dimension of economic warfare, there's always a question of efficacy. Is the intended goal of the sanctions that are brought by a certain country effective? Do they achieve what they have set out to gain? Well, to walk us through all of that tonight, again, Dr. Sanjay Paul of Elizabethtown College, and I turn it over to him now. Dr. Paul, good to see you once again. Good to hear from you once again. Stage is yours, sir.
Thank you, Russell. Can you hear me properly?
Yes, we can hear you quite well.
Wonderful. Thank you for that very generous introduction. And you have posed a number of important questions that perhaps we can discuss as we move on, as we move forward. But I have a very short PowerPoint presentation to sort of add to the video that we just saw. So perhaps I could begin by sharing that video. That PowerPoint rather. Can someone let me know if we are able to see it?
We are. We can see it quite well, Sanjay. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. So in the video, there was mention of sanctions not really being a new thing. They have been around for a while, and the League of Nations was sort of mentioned. So here is actually a sanction that was imposed by the League of Nations in 1935. It was actually imposed against Italy because they had invaded Abyssinia, Ethiopia, and the League of Nations, castigated Italy for carrying out that action. However, in the end, it did not turn out to be a very successful action by the League. The sanctions were not very effective, in large part because Italy was seen as a bulwark against Nazi Germany. Remember, this is the second half of the 1930s, and there was interest in a sort of combating, this sort of growing threat from Nazi Germany. In any case, that's one of the less successful sanctions of the last century. Let me mention, give a little bit of data on the Russian economy. So if you look at Russia's GDP growth meaning growth of the Russian economy, gross domestic product. So the blue bars, are where they did well, where the economy was growing, and the sort of yellow bars are where the economy sort of contracted, sort of like a recession. And so if you look at this chart, they did, mostly well over this period. But remember, in 2014 is when they invaded Crimea. And so there was a brief period of negative economic growth following the invasion of Crimea. A number of sanctions were imposed on Russia by the West. So quite likely, that minus 2% GDP growth in 2015 that you see on the graph was a consequence in part of those sanctions. But then the economy rebounded fairly quickly. As the video had mentioned, Russia imposed counter sanctions. They took steps to sort of insulate themselves from the worst effect of the sanctions. They could not import a lot of goods, including consumer goods, and so they started producing it themselves. And as you can see from this graph, they seem to have emerged after the 2014 round of sanctions, reasonably okay. You have 0.2% growth in 2016, and then it continues to go up till 2018. And then 2020, of course, was the pandemic, the minus 2.7% growth. And then they rebounded from the pandemic in 21 with a 5.6% growth. And then in 2022, they invaded Ukraine in February, and they were hit with a far more gauntlet of sanctions than perhaps what Putin had expected, and that actually took a toll. So the 2022 data shows that their economy contracted by 2.1%. The IMF has come out with some estimates of how the Russian economy is likely to do in 2023, and as you might suspect, not very well. However, I think the IMF is thinking they might eke out a small gain in 2023, a very modest economic rebound. But what made it even more interesting was that this economic growth exceeded the estimate for UK's economic growth. And that set off some interesting debates in Parliament. How come the UK economic growth is likely to be even smaller than Russia's economic growth in 2023? So that's on the GDP front. On the inflation front, what you see is Russia's inflation has fallen since April of 2022, when the sanctions, was starting to be felt. And then, of course, there have been additional sanctions over time. But inflation has fallen, right? So from a peak of almost 18% in April, in January, it was down to just under 12%. So inflation has actually come down. And this sort of illustrates the sort of mixed bag of effects on the Russian economy as a result of the Western sanctions. GDP growth fell, but it's expected to rebound a little bit in 2023, and inflation has come down since last year. On the trade front, they had a trade surplus of $21 billion in January of last year, of 2022. That has now shrunk to $9 billion in 2023 January. That's the estimated figure. And that is a combination of, that's in large part due to a decline in their exports. So these sanctions are taking a bite out of their exports, and that is being reflected in the trade balance figures. So a quick a note on China. The US has been ratcheting up its actions against China. So in the most recent iteration, the US companies are prohibited from selling certain advanced technologies to China, and this has become really quite restrictive in recent weeks, actually. There are also curbs on certain kinds of US investments in China. particularly what the US government thinks of as sort of critical sectors. And so US firms will find it very difficult to invest in those sectors in China. Last year in 2022, they spent about $11 billion, buying or investing in Chinese companies. This may not seem like a large figure, for the US or for China, $11 billion. But the investments might have been made, in certain key sectors, which were particularly beneficial to US firms. And so by not being allowed to carry out that kind of investment any further, it might put some US companies at a disadvantage, especially when it comes to competing with European firms, which may not face the same kind of stringent restrictions on dealing with China. So this is something to keep in mind, that the American firms might pay a price in view of these increasingly stringent sanctions being contemplated by the Biden administration. So some final thoughts before we get into the Q&A part. So what you are seeing as a result of the sanctions, both against Russia and then the actions being taken against China, maybe we are starting to see some new alliances being formed. Russia is buying military equipment from Iran. It's buying a lot of goods from Turkey and selling goods to Turkey. China also has not joined the sanctioned regime, and they are keeping their economic activities going as far as possible. And in Africa, in South Africa also, Russia has sort of found an ally, and so you're starting to see this sort of grouping of countries which might shake the sort of international order in ways that perhaps we had not thought before. Secondly, we might see a weakening of international organizations such as the World Trade Organization, which has been a sort of the primary moving force for increased trade around the world after World War II, bringing down tariffs and quotas and so on. But if the US is acting unilaterally or even with key allies in Europe, on trade sanctions and so on and so forth, that is actually going to make the World Trade Organization less relevant. And so the very organization that the United States had helped set up after World War II and had been an integral part of ever since, well, until very recently, that organization, along with some others, are at risk of becoming weaker. And finally, national security interests, if they trump economic interests, which seems increasingly plausible, we might see less international trade and less globalization. So these are some of the sort of possible effects of what we see in the world today with the use of sanctions, with the use of tariffs, with the use of economic warfare. And so perhaps, Russell, on that note, I can stop and we can talk about.
Well, I think that's an excellent way to begin our discussion, and a number of questions are beginning to flow in. But moderator's privilege, let me just ask the first one, if I might. Clearly, oil is the largest income stream for Russia. And while many of the countries in Europe, notably Germany, are turning away from the Russian oil spigot, in fact, South Africa and Hungary and India and a number of other countries are continuing to keep Russia afloat by buying their oil. Economic sanctions which have been brought against Russia are severe and they are many in number. But Russia's economy is in the top 10 or 12 in the world. So it's not a little country that can be pushed around. Do you think the oil will be enough to enable them to sustain another year or two of this war? What's your view?
Well, I think estimates of economic growth do not show Russia growing strongly anytime soon. As I mentioned, I think the IMF estimate, which perhaps was one of the more optimistic estimates of economic growth for Russia, puts it at just above zero for the year. So a slight positive growth. But the estimates from other organizations like the World Bank are far more pessimistic. So they are looking at negative GDP growth over the short run, and so I think decline in exports and the decline in oil revenue could have a significant effect on. It has had a significant effect on their trade balance, on their budget, on the revenues that they earn, and so that I think is very likely to become sort of even more aggravated as the West has moved away from its reliance, especially Europe, as you pointed out. Countries like Germany have moved away from the reliance on oil and gas. But also, I think the imposition of new kinds of sanctions, which have not been used before, where the United States and Europe are going after, for example, shipping companies that ship oil or, third countries. Even those kinds of shipping could be affected by the sanctions. So it's not just the direct sales of oil and natural gas to the US and to the West that is being throttled by the sanctions. Increasingly, it could be other kinds of exports to these other countries that have sort of allowed Russia to escape the worst effects of the sanctions.
Here's a question that deals with targeting individuals. The questioner says that sanctions so often hurt the people, unintended victims, rather than the leaders who quite often live well despite the sanctions. Is there a way to more effectively target these leaders rather than the people? What do you say?
I think that's a very important question. We have seen examples in the past of sanctions being levied against countries which have really ended up hurting large numbers of their populations, and in almost all cases they are the poorest and the least able to escape these kinds of things. So there has been talk of smart sanctions, targeted sanctions, to sort of narrow the effect of these actions to certain sectors of the economy. I think that is clearly a target. For example, in the case of Iran, it has to prevent them from developing nuclear weapons. But also increasingly against individuals. The United States government comes out with a list of new list, it seems almost every other day, of people that are being sanctioned. They are in Russia, they are in China, they are in North Korea, and so those perhaps are being used more and more to go after individuals or companies or sectors.
Mm-hmm. One of the criticisms of economic sanctions is whether they are truly effective. Do they accomplish the goal that has been stated? And I think we can all look at a number of sanctions that the United States has brought against any number of countries in the last 20 years or so. And the question is really, if the aim was to topple a despotic leader, if it was to change government policy in a particular country, if it was, for instance, to do something to boost or enhance civil rights, human rights in that country, when we look at the overall field, just how successful do you think our sanctions policy has been in the last couple of decades? What do you say?
So in the case of, I'll go slightly further back from the last 2 decades. In the case of Rhodesia, which was mentioned in the video, sanctions appear to have had an effect. Now, those sanctions were approved by the United Nations Security Council. So they had the sort of imprimatur of the world in acting against apartheid in in Rhodesia, or the regime of Rhodesia. But more recently, if you look at Myanmar, where the objective of the sanctions was not really, it was not not to punish them for invading another country or things of that nature. It was to improve the human rights system in Myanmar because of the treatment of the Rohingya Muslims by the government and the military. And those sanctions really have not had the intended effect. I mean, the military is still in power. They are supported by China. India, its neighbor to the West, is not very keen on seeing China become increasingly more dominant in that region. So they have been sort of silent as well. So I think, when you look at those kinds of cases, the sanctions have not turned out to be particularly effective. And if you think of the sanctions against China, to broaden it to tariffs, which is part of economic warfare, which was started by President Trump, where he started imposing tariffs on Chinese goods to punish them for various things. It was a mixture of economic objectives and human rights objectives. Human rights being the treatment of Uyghur Muslims in the Xinjiang province. None of those sanctions, none of those things have changed. So in a sense, those sanctions have turned out to be fairly, futile in that they achieve those objectives. In the case of Russia, you are starting to see some very significant effects. Even though the thinking appears to be that the sanctions by themselves will not cause Russia to call off its invasion of Ukraine, but it increases the cost of doing so, especially even in terms of military supplies and so on. It will become harder for Russia to sort of replenish those supply chains. And so in a limited sense, you are achieving an objective, but perhaps not the primary objective.
Well, it's certainly a more costly endeavor for the Russians. There's no doubt about it. But of course, the collateral damage in lives is just exponentially horrible. Let's turn to China and Taiwan for just a moment. One of the questioners is asking just how much do you think that the Taiwan issue is a factor in the economic dispute that exists between us, the United States, and China? So let's walk through that for just a moment, if we might. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's an important aspect of our dispute, of the U.S.-China dispute, and I'll focus on the economic aspect of it. And Taiwan is a major semiconductor manufacturer. So I have a feeling my internet connection is not being very cooperative. So sorry if my video goes
Technology
off.
for you.
I think the figure is very high. Around 90% or so of advanced chips are manufactured in Taiwan by TSMC, if I got the name, if I got the acronym correct. I think Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. It's the largest in semiconductor manufacturing, and they produce a lot in Taiwan. So if that were to fall into say Chinese hands, and the West is deprived of semiconductor chips, we have already seen the effect of some supply chain problems in that sector couple of years ago, maybe a year ago or so, when prices of new cars and various kinds of things that use advanced semiconductor chips, prices of those things went up very sharply. So it is a significant economic issue for the United States that Taiwan remain.
Yeah, in fact, quite a number of products were not manufactured because of the scarcity of those chips. Now we're seeing a number of companies looking to bring fabs back to the United States. Fabs, as the factories are called. But that's not something that's done overnight. That takes years. Are we in, this may well be the final question, Sanjay, because we're coming up on the end of our hour, but my question to you is this: are we in an either-or situation? It's either we go to physical combat with somebody, or we have economic sanctions to try to bring about some degree of change, or is there some other policy that we might utilize to try to create whatever the desired change might be to bring that into effect? Is there some middle ground? What do you think?
Yeah. So I think sanctions can have sometimes somewhat intended effects, but they could also have unintended consequences. So one example that one could think of in the slightly more distant past, during World War II, the United States imposed a kind of trade embargo on Japan when they were starting to become more aggressive in Asia, and this was before Pearl Harbor. And so once the sanctions were imposed, once the trade embargo was imposed, and the pain inflicted on Japan because they could not import certain materials and so on, that possibly led them to attack Pearl Harbor. So it's possible that the attack on Pearl Harbor, which was preceded by the sanctions imposed by the United States, those might have been a factor in that decision. So here is where sanctions actually precede an effect, which was to prevent military action. Perhaps the increased use of the international financial architecture, the SWIFT financial, the payment system, for example, is a way of targeting, individuals and companies much more effectively, and they can have very large effects on the parties involved. So a quick anecdote: a few years ago, the Hong Kong chief executive at the time had carried out some anti-democratic actions in Hong Kong, and the United States actually imposed certain sanctions on the chief executive. So this is like the president of the United States, and the sanctions were such that this chief executive of Hong Kong had to withdraw her salary in cash. She could not get paid by her, there could not be a bank transfer, and this was a very substantial salary. The Hong Kong chief executive is one or two of the most highly paid leaders of a country. And so on her salary, she had to go and collect in bags and bring them home in cash because of the US sanctions. So this goes to show the real effectiveness of the US sort of power over the international financial architecture.
That's a great, great story, I must say, to illustrate, as you say, the power that the United States has when it comes to trying to effect change. It's also a great story to try to illustrate how we want to pinpoint our sanctions against the malefactors themselves as opposed to the populace. All right, big discussion. I want to thank you so very, very much, Dr. Sanjay Paul. I'm going to turn it back to Joyce Davis for the last words.
Well, I'm actually going to, I think, let Ella, one of our attendees, our participants, have a say here. She says this is a fascinating discussion. The only reason I'm not posing questions, she says, is because the moderator's questions are so good and Dr. Paul's responses are so thorough. Thank you, Ella, for that. And Dr. Paul, thank you once again for sharing your significant expertise with us. And Russell, I'm going to have to get you to do this more often, this moderating thing. But also, before we leave, just remember, next week, we're back here again at 5 o'clock. And that time, the topic is going to be on Latin America. You don't want to miss that when we have a expert from the U.S. Army War College who will be joining us, Evan Ellis, Dr. Evan Ellis. So please don't miss that one. And I do want to point out to everyone here that we're heading into a gala, the Women's History Month. And the World Affairs Council is partnering with the Civic Club for a series of events on the weekend of March 24th through 26th. We will be holding the International Women's Conference on Saturday, March 25th at the Civic Club. And guess what? Due to a generous sponsor, it is free. It will even include a luncheon, and we will have an opening keynote from the executive director of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, who'll talk about the state of equality and justice for women in Pennsylvania. We will be
Can the guys come?
The guys are more, and that's why I said it's going to be actually a man who's going to be giving the keynote.
Oh.
And then we will, of course, have a panel after that of women who will talk about the top issues for women around the world. We'll have a Ukrainian expert. We'll have someone coming, one of our board members from Sudan is going to be talking. So please look on our website and you'll see information on how to register for those. But once again, I'm not going to hold you any longer. It's been a fascinating, as Ella says, a fascinating discussion. And Dr. Sanjay, we are in your debt. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joyce, and thank you, Russell.
All right.
Thanks, sir. Good night,
Bye-bye, everyone. See you next week.